This is Mang from Design Plus Code. Welcome back. Today we're going to learn how to style in CSS using very basic techniques. The first thing we want to do is to go to the layouts folder and you will find index.css. Now I want you to do something drastic. We're going to Command A everything, so select everything and press delete. That's it. We start from scratch and there's nothing in our CSS. I didn't want to spoil you with all of the complexity of a starting template, and having to edit something that is existing is a lot harder than starting from scratch. So as with any CSS, we are going to start with a body tag, and the body tags exist anywhere. It's basically the main sort of artboard for your layout. And we're gonna set up very global styles such as the font family, right? As a designer, we love beautiful fonts. And of course you can use, your own custom fonts, but in this case, we're gonna use the Apple font. So Apple system, which is SF font. And we're also gonna have a bunch of fallback. As you can see here, we have some problem with the wrapping. So we're gonna use Option Z to enable this. So again, you can see that I'm using SF font, which is called Apple system. And then we have some fallbacks such as, Blink, and this is for like different browsers. And then we have Roboto and Oxygen and a bunch of fallback fonts in case that, for example, for Windows, you won't have the SF font. So that's really important. When you code in CSS, for every line for a property such as font family, we need to finish it with semicolon like this. Otherwise, it's gonna give you an error. So for example, if I didn't have this and I wanted to set up the margin to 0, it's gonna give me an error. So never forget the semicolon at the end. And now we're good to go. The second thing I did again is to use the margin property to set up to 0. Otherwise, as you can see, we have a bit of a default margin that's kind of ugly and we don't want that. So we're gonna set it to 0. Now I was mentioning about custom fonts, and I want to show you a very quick way to have a custom font. So you go to Google and you go to Google Fonts. You go here and let's say you're gonna select a very popular one called Open Sun. You select this one and then you're gonna select it. And here, if you open, you can see that I can implement that to my website by the standard way, which in this case is not standard at all because it's a React app. And I can also import it. So all I need to do really is to add this line import at the very beginning of my CSS file, like this. And then once I have imported that, then I can select the font family and I can replace it like this. And there you go, you will have the Open Sun font. Now again, feel free to use your own custom font for your design, but for the purpose of this course, for my personal design, I'm just going to use Command Z to go back in history, and I'm going to put back the Apple system font. We're also going to set a global font size of 20, so font-size 20. And by the way, whenever you type these properties, you have auto-completion, which is super useful if you want to have the list of properties that you can use pertaining to font, for example, and that is extremely useful whenever you start coding in CSS or in other languages. So in this case, we're going to set it to 20. By the way, I suggest something between 15 and 20 as the main body text because that's really good for readability for your users. There's also another property that I really like to use. It's called WebKit Font Smoothing. I like to set it to anti-alias. And this only works for Safari. So as you can see here, for example, the font is a little bit bolder than what it should look like in the design tool, for example. If you're a designer, this is something that can kind of itch you a little bit, like for me, but it's not a big deal. It's still very good for readability as it is. Another thing that I want to talk about is the units that we're using. Now, I'm using, pixel units because I believe that this is the friendliest way for designers to learn about CSS, for example, and the units, because it's very consistent to how you would use it in Figma or Sketch. But of course, there's the EM units and the REM units and the percentage units. Those are the things that you will learn later on that may help you to get a layout that is more adaptive. But for now, let's just focus on the pixel units. We're also going to set a line height of 1.3. And line height is really important in design because when you have a huge block of text like this one, and especially when you have maybe hundreds or thousands of words in a single page, not having the proper line height of 1.2 to 1.45, and that's really good for readability. So the next thing I want to show you is to set a global style for the links, because in this case, for example, we have a link, and usually the link is everywhere. This is something that we use all the time for buttons, for links, and it's really important to set a global style for it. So I'm going to start with, let's say, the color that I like, and I'm going to use that from the design tool. So as you can see, this is the design, and I'm going to pick the color that I like for the color for my links, and I'm going to copy this code, which is a hex code, and I'm going to paste it right here, again using the semicolon at the end. And when I save, you can see that the link and any future link that use the A tag is going to have this color value. I don't like the underline style, so I'm going to disable that. So text decoration and set to none. And then the font weight is 600. This is for how bold it is. So as you can see, this is how my links are going to look like. Okay, so let's start planning our design a little bit. As you can see, we have the header, which is by default in our React project, but I think it's not really nice right now, so we're gonna hide that. So what we're gonna do here is simply design the background and the title and text and the button here so that we have something to get us started. The first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the layouts here and I'm gonna click on index.js. And this is basically our global template. We have a lot of stuff that we really don't need. So for example, we don't really need this div container that has inline styling, which I personally don't like when I see inline styling inside the JavaScript code, because I like to separate the two so that it's a lot cleaner when you program the actual component, the functionalities versus the styling. I like to separate both. So what I'm gonna do is to delete this div right here at line 18, and because I deleted the starting tag, I'm also gonna delete the end tag for the div. Otherwise it's gonna give me an error. So it should look like something like this. The second thing I'm gonna delete is the header. So I'm gonna select the entire line for the header and delete it. So when I save, it should look like this. Okay, so we're good with our global template. We can head to the page. And here in the page, we have the container div, but we want to be able to simply have the hero element. And we're going to put the title, the paragraph, and the button. So first of all, we're going to create a div with a class name of hero. And again, you have to close it, right? Inside that div, I also want to have a group. So it's going to be called hero group. And this is a bit of a planning in advance, but a group is essentially like when you're grouping a bunch of layers inside Figma, for example. It allows you to have more flexibility later on to add some margins and to add some alignment, positioning, and so on. So it's really, really important sometimes to have a bunch of wrappers, if you will. And so we're grouping them together so that we have more flexibility. So for example, if our entire thing here is the hero container, then inside it, you have a bunch of elements. So such as the titles here, the button here, and this. So what you want to do is to group all of these together so that they follow the same alignment. And that's why you would need another grouping so that you have more flexibility. So for example, you can align that in the middle, you can have some margin and stuff like that. So that's what this hero group is going to be for. And at the end, we're going to move our 3 elements. So cut and then paste it right here and then save. Make sure you have the proper indentation so that it's much more readable in the end. So it should look something like this. Obviously, we're going to set the word wrapping. Now, when you're designing with CSS, you need these class names to be able to reference that in the CSS file. So I'm going to go to the CSS file called index.css in layouts, and then I'm going to start implementing the style. So let's start with the hero CSS. So the name that I gave, and then inside this, I want to set a background image. The background image is going to use the background tag, then URL, single quote, and this is going to give me the link to the URL of the image. Now, since I don't have the image yet into my project, what I need to do is to create a new folder for the images. So I'm going to go right click on SRC, click on new folder, and then name it images. I'm going to right click on it and then reveal in Finder. It's going to open the images folder. Now we provided the assets, so if you download it and open it, you can just drag and drop all the files here. And that's it. We can go back to our project. Now, this, if we open the images folder, you'll see all the files that we just dropped. And from here, we can just start implementing the image into our code. Now let's start implementing the image. We're going to start by .. which goes to the parent of one folder. So if we're inside layouts, it's going to go to SRC. And then from here, you can already see the reference to the proper folder. So for example, we're going to select images, and then we're going to start with perhaps wallpaper 2. And then save, and it gives us this. Let's go with 3. So to follow our design, we want this to be approximately 920. So we're going to set the height to 920 pixel. And then we also want to make sure that our image is not super resized as it is. So we're going to use something called background size, and we're going to use cover. Boom, it looks much better now. And we're going to center the position of our image as well. So we're going to do background position and then center. Now we're going to start positioning our content. Remember, we used to have a hero group container. So we're going to use this to position correctly and give a proper size to this content. So hero group, and then set the properties. First of all, we want to set the margin to 0. And we also want to set the max width to 500 pixel. And now what the max width means is that it is going to have a maximum width of 500. If not, if it's lower than that, it's just gonna take 100% of the width of your device. And that's what's really cool about max width. And we're also gonna use margin auto so that we can center it within this. So when you use margin, you have a bunch of values. It always starts with the top value, so margin top, and then the second value is right. And so auto means that it's gonna take, automatically the remaining space on each side. So top and then auto, and this is the equivalent of 0 and auto. When you don't explicitly write the two remaining values, it just assumes that it's going to repeat itself. So 0 auto, 0 auto. If I was to write 0, it's just going to say 0 on all sides. So 0 auto, and it's the equivalent of having auto on the right and auto on the left, which allows us to have the centering of our content. And now we're going to add some padding. So padding 150 pixel, 50 pixel. So again, top, right, and because we're not explicitly writing the remaining two, it's just going to say top, right, bottom, left. And so it's going to be 150 from the top, and then 50 here, and then 50 here, as well as 150 at the bottom. Obviously, we want to align our text to center, and this is pretty simple stuff. Then we're also going to set the h1 tag. Now, because our h1 doesn't have a class name, we can reference it by simply naming the tag itself. But this can be a bit dangerous because sometimes you might have multiple h1 inside of hero. So it's going to be confusing itself without a h1. But because we know for sure that we're not going to have another h1 here, we're going to use this. But obviously in the future, we're going to try to have a class for every single element. By default, the heading titles usually have a lot of margins. And you can see that by right-clicking this and inspect. When you inspect, you have access to a lot of properties inside your design. So if you mouse over each of these elements, you can see their properties and you can see how much spacing that they take. And here the H1 is having a lot of margins at the top and at the bottom. So that's why we're going to set it to 0. We're also going to set the color to white, the font size to 60 pixel, and then the line height to 1.2. So it's going to look like this. Now we just need the P for paragraph and set the color to RGBA is this time. Now RGBA simply means red, green, blue, and alpha. And the reason why we need to use this is because we want to control the alpha inside the color. And the main colors that you need to know is black and white. If it's black, it's 0, 0, 0, and if it's white, it's 255, 255, 255. So we're gonna set it. And then lastly, we set the opacity, so 0.8. Now, if you save it, you're gonna see that the opacity is applied. This color has opacity, this one doesn't. I'm gonna make the font size bigger, so font size to 30 pixel. The line height to 1.5 because of the size of the text. Now this is pretty accurate to the design. As you can see here, we just need to add the button here that says watch the video. So we're gonna style the hero A for the link, because a link itself is using the tag called A. Okay, we're gonna set the font size to 17, the font weight to 600, and then we're also gonna set the color to white, and we're gonna make it completely in capitals. We're gonna use text transform uppercase, and like this it's gonna transform your text to all caps. Next we're gonna set the background, and we're gonna use the RGBA again, but this time it's gonna be black, 0.0.0 and then 0.7. You can barely see it, but there's a background of 70% black right here. To make it more visible, we're gonna set the padding instead of using height and width, which is very fixed. But when you use a padding, it gives a padding and it's more adaptive. So if the text changes, it's gonna grow the button in size. So we're gonna set the padding to 9 pixel, again top, 20 pixel right, and because we're not completing the last two values, it's gonna be top, right, bottom, left. And then save it, we're good. Now we're gonna add a border. And we have to set it to 1 pixel, it's gonna be solid. And then again using RGBA, 255, 255, 255, at 0.25 in opacity, so 25%. And lastly, we love rounded corners. So we're gonna add that border radius to 20 pixel, let's say. And now we have a pill shape button. Another thing that's really cool about Visual Studio Code is that we can actually change the color using their color picker. So if you mouse over the value, you can change to any value that you want, and it's going to apply to that here. But obviously, we already know exactly our values, and these values can be picked from the design tool itself. You have these values. If you go to design, as in Figma, for example, there's a tab called code, and here you can have the CSS values, but also you can have it in code, which is exactly the same values that you're gonna have right here. And that's really nice because everything is gonna be consistent. And if you're not super familiar with these values and the RGBA and stuff like that, you can just copy and paste the value from the design tool. And it's gonna have pretty much almost exactly as you would have done it from scratch. Now at this point, as a designer, you've learned enough to start creating your own design. I mean, this is just basic CSS and basic setup, bringing your own images. So I definitely suggest having your own background, your own title, your own description, your own button style, and set it from the design tool itself using the code inside the code tab and apply it here. And I would love to see what you have created so far from this course. Share it on Twitter, and if it's really, really interesting, then I would love to retweet it. So thanks for following along so far, and I hope you enjoyed this course. We're gonna learn a lot more stuff. This is just basic CSS. We're gonna learn how to do adaptive layouts using CSS Grid. It's gonna be even more powerful to control the layout the way that we want and to show it and to present it to our audience the way that we want it. So I'll see you next time.